Hid a stray dog behind my bedroom curtain at 2 a.m., but my dad's flashlight found us before we could explain a single word of it. My dad's flashlight was 3 inches from my face, and I was lying to him with a straight face about why there was a dog crate hidden behind my bedroom curtains. Let me back up, because none of that makes sense yet. And honestly, it still barely makes sense to me either, even weeks later. Even after everything got sorted out, and my mom started telling this story at dinner parties. Like it's the funniest thing that ever happened in our house. It wasn't funny at the time. At the time, I thought I was going to get grounded until I was 30. I'm Ashley. I was 17 that spring, a junior in high school, and my best friend since fourth grade was a girl named Bree, short for Brianna, who had the kind of personality that made teachers either love her or write her up for talking too much. There was no in-between with Bree. She was loud, she was funny, she cried at commercials for insurance companies, and she had wanted a dog her entire life. Her parents were allergic, or said they were, which Bree always suspected was just a convenient excuse her dad used because he didn't want to deal with a dog chewing up his golf shoes. My parents weren't allergic to anything, except apparently surprises. We lived in a pretty normal split-level house in a pretty normal suburb of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where everyone's lawn looked the same, and everyone knew everyone else's business within about a week of moving in. My dad, Mark, worked in insurance himself, actually, which is a detail that matters later. And my mom, Denise, was a nurse who worked 12-hour shifts 3 days a week, which meant our house ran on a schedule that felt like clockwork. My little brother Tyler was 13 that year, deep in that phase where he thought he was smarter than everyone in the family and loved nothing more than catching me doing something wrong so he could hold it over my head like a trophy. The night this all happened, my parents had said yes to Bree sleeping over, which was normal. We did it almost every other weekend. What was not normal was that earlier that week on a Tuesday, Bree had shown up at school, practically vibrating with excitement because she'd found a dog. Not adopted a dog, found one. There's a difference, and it's a difference that turned out to matter a lot. She told me during lunch, hunched over her tray of cafeteria pizza like she was about to reveal state secrets, that on her way home from her cousin's house the night before, she'd seen a small, scruffy dog wandering along the shoulder of Route 9, no collar, clearly terrified, darting between the guardrail and the ditch every time a car passed. She'd made her cousin pull over. She'd coaxed the dog into the back seat with half a granola bar. And now the dog was living secretly in her cousin's garage because her own house was a no-go with her allergic dad. And her cousin's mom had said the dog could stay for exactly 1 week while Bri figured something out. The problem was, the 1 week was almost up, and Bri had not figured anything out, except for one increasingly desperate plan, which she explained to me with the kind of confidence that should have been a warning sign. "You have a whole basement," she said. "Your parents are working. What if I just brought him over for one night? We hide him downstairs, and by morning I'll have found a shelter or a rescue or something." I want to be very clear that 17-year-old me knew this was a bad idea. I want that on the record. But Bri had this way of looking at you when she wanted something. This specific combination of pleading and absolute certainty that you were going to say yes eventually, so you might as well save everyone some time. And I had never once in 7 years of friendship successfully said no to that look. "One night," I said, "and he has to be quiet. My dad wakes up if a leaf falls on the roof." That should have been my first small detail to remember. The thing about my dad being a light sleeper, because it was going to become the single most important fact in the entire story about 6 hours later. The second detail worth remembering is that my mom kept a very specific, very particular candle collection on the shelf above the basement stairs, ceramic ones she'd bought on a work trip to Charleston, and she counted them. I swear to God she counted them, the way some people count silverware. The third detail is that our dog crate, an old one from a dog we'd had years before named Buster, who'd passed away when I was 12, was still sitting collapsed in the corner of the garage because nobody in my family had ever been able to bring themselves to get rid of it. Bree showed up at 7 that evening with her overnight bag in one hand and, I kid you not, a dog carrier zipped shut and covered with her jacket in the other, like she was smuggling contraband through customs, which, in a sense, she absolutely was. "Bree," I said, standing in my driveway in the fading evening light. "What is that?" "That's Waffles," she said. "I named him Waffles. Doesn't he look like a Waffles?" I unzipped the carrier about 2 inches and looked in at a small brown and white terrier mix with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down, shivering slightly, staring up at me with the kind of eyes that, I'll admit, immediately started dismantling every ounce of resolve I had walked outside with. "You said one night," I reminded her. "It is one night," she said. Technically, it's already been one night at my cousin's, so this is just like night two of a temporary situation. I did not have a good comeback for that kind of logic, mostly because there wasn't one. There was just Bree's brain working in the specific way it always worked, bending reality until it matched what she wanted to be true. We got waffles inside through the side door while my parents were both upstairs. My dad watching some true crime documentary in his recliner, and my mom folding laundry in front of the TV in their room, and we set up camp in the basement with the door shut, which in our house counted as a soundproofing strategy, though it very much was not one. For the first hour, it was actually kind of great. Waffles turned out to be sweet and calm once he settled in. Curling up on a blanket we'd dragged down from the hall closet, occasionally lifting his head to sniff at the popcorn we were eating on the couch. Bree kept saying things like, "We're basically fostering him, and this could be really good practice for when I get my own place." And I let myself relax into the idea that maybe this would just be fine. Maybe we'd get through the night and figure out the shelter thing in the morning, like she'd said. Then around 11, Tyler texted me from his room upstairs asking why I sounded like I was talking to a dog. That was the first crack, the first small, unsettling sign that things were not as contained as we thought. I texted him back something dismissive, told him he was hearing things, told him to go to sleep, and he did, or at least he stopped texting. But it planted this little seed of dread in my stomach that didn't fully go away for the rest of the night. Sound carries weird in our house. The vents run basement to upstairs in a way that means if you talk too loud in the basement, you can sometimes hear it faintly in the room above the furnace closet, which happened to be Tyler's room. By midnight, Bree and I had moved on to watching some horror movie neither of us was really paying attention to, more focused on Waffles, who had woken up and started exploring the basement with the manic energy of a dog that had spent a week cooped up in someone's garage. He knocked over an empty soda can. He got his leash tangled around the leg of the coffee table. At one point, he found an old tennis ball wedged under the couch, presumably a relic from Buster's era, and he would not stop batting it against the hardwood floor, this rhythmic thock, 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 that in the quiet of a sleeping house sounded, to my increasingly paranoid ears, like it was echoing through the entire structure of our home. "Bree, you have to grab the ball," I whispered. "I'm trying," she whispered back, crawling half under the couch, her voice muffled. "He's fast." This is the part where I should tell you what my parents' bedroom is directly above. It's the kitchen and part of the living room, not the basement, which under normal circumstances would have made this whole plan slightly more plausible. But my dad, in one of those small habits that becomes a defining character trait once you're an adult looking back on it, could not sleep through unfamiliar sound. Not loud sound necessarily, unfamiliar sound. He'd wake up from a full and total silence if the refrigerator made a click it didn't usually make. My mom used to joke that he must have been a soldier in a past life, always listening for the enemy. At around 12:30, we finally got Waffles calmed down and back onto his blanket, and I genuinely thought we were in the clear. Bree and I sat back on the couch, and I remember letting out this breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding, the specific relief of thinking a crisis has passed when it actually hasn't even started yet. That was when we heard it, not from the basement, from upstairs. The unmistakable, deliberate creak of my parents' bedroom door opening, followed by the soft, careful footsteps of someone moving down the hallway, trying very hard not to wake anyone else up, which is a genuinely funny thing when you consider that we were the ones supposed to be worried about waking people up, and instead it was my dad, wide awake at 12:30 in the morning, tiptoeing around his own house because he thought he'd heard something and didn't want to scare off whatever it was. Bree and I looked at each other in the dim blue light of the paused movie, and I have never in my life communicated so much through pure eye contact. Her eyes were saying, "I don't know what to do." Mine were saying, "Neither do I," but also, "Why is this happening to me specifically?" I did the only thing I could think of on short notice, which was scoop Waffles up off his blanket and shove him, gently but with real urgency, into my backpack, which was sitting open on the floor by the couch, half full of school books that I hastily rearranged so there'd be room. He was small enough to fit, thank God, and he seemed confused but not upset, and I zipped the bag about 3/4 of the way, leaving a gap for air, and pulled it close against my body, just as the basement door creaked open at the top of the stairs. "Ashley?" My dad's voice floated down. "You girls still up?" "Yeah, Dad, just watching a movie," I called back, and I want you to understand that my voice came out sounding almost completely normal, which still surprises me because internally I was doing the math on how many years of my life I was about to lose off my lifespan from stress. "Keep it down a little, okay?" "I thought I heard something weird." "Sorry, we'll be quieter," I said, and I heard him pause at the top of the stairs for a second, just a second. This small, excruciating silence where I genuinely thought he might come all the way down, and then the door creaked shut again and his footsteps retreated back down the hallway. Bree exhaled so hard I thought she might pass out. Okay, she whispered. Okay, that was close, but we're fine. We were not fine. We were about 40 minutes away from significantly not fine. Because here's the thing about a small dog stuffed into a backpack for even a short period of time. He does not love it. And a dog that does not love something eventually tells you so, in whatever way a dog knows how to tell you things. And Waffles' way, once I finally let him out of the bag about 10 minutes later, was to become extremely enthusiastically vocal about his displeasure and also, unfortunately, about his need to go outside, which became clear about 15 minutes after that when he started scratching frantically at the base of the basement door that led out to our backyard. He needs to go out, Bree whispered, sounding genuinely panicked now. It's 1 in the morning. Ashley, he's going to have an accident on your basement floor if we don't let him out, and then how do we explain that in the morning? She had a point. An infuriating, undeniable point. And so at roughly 1:45 in the morning, we made the second terrible decision of the night, which was to crack open the basement's side door, the one that led directly out to the side yard by the garage, and let Waffles slip outside to do his business while the two of us stood in the doorway in our socks, shivering in the cold spring air, praying that a dog with the energy level of a dog who had spent a week in a garage would hurry up. He did not hurry up. He found approximately 400 new and exciting smells in our side yard and investigated every single one of them with the focus of a detective at a crime scene, while Bree and I stood there arguing about whether we should just go grab him, which risked him bolting, or wait him out, which risked freezing to death and also risked exactly what ended up happening, which was that a light came on in the kitchen window directly above us. We both froze. I remember grabbing Bree's arm so hard I probably left marks. The kitchen light meant someone was awake and downstairs, and given the angle, if that someone walked toward the sink, they would have a direct line of sight out the window to the side yard, where a small brown and white dog was currently sniffing his way around our recycling bins in the moonlight. Waffles, I hissed, as quietly and urgently as I possibly could. Get over here, right now. For a genuine miracle, he actually listened, trotting back toward us with his tail wagging like this was the best night of his life, which for him, I suppose, it kind of was. I scooped him up. We ducked back inside, and I eased the door shut with the kind of slow, controlled care usually reserved for diffusing something explosive. Through the small window in the door, I watched my mom's silhouette move across the kitchen, fill a glass of water at the sink, and stand there for a moment looking out at the exact yard we had just vacated. My heart was doing something in my chest that I'm pretty sure wasn't medically normal. She lingered for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 30 seconds, then turned, flicked off the light, and headed back upstairs. Bree and I sat down hard on the basement stairs, Waffles squirming happily in my lap, and just breathed for a minute. We are never doing this again, I said. Agreed, Bree said. 100% agreed. We should have stopped there. We should have taken that as the universe's final warning and just accepted whatever consequences would come with waking my parents up right then and confessing everything. But it was almost 1 in the morning. We were both exhausted and a little delirious, and we had convinced ourselves that we had, against all odds, actually made it. Just a few more hours until morning, we told ourselves. Just get through the night. What we did not know, what we could not have possibly known at that point, was that the night was nowhere near done with us, and that the real crisis, the one that would end with my dad's flashlight 3 inches from my face, was still about 2 hours away. Bree fell asleep first, sometime around 1:30, curled up on one end of the pull-out couch with Waffles wedged happily against her stomach, like he'd lived there his whole life. I stayed awake a little longer, running through contingency plans in my head, the kind of plans that only make sense to a sleep-deprived 17-year-old at 1 in the morning. I decided that if we could just get through until 6, when my dad usually left for an early gym session before work, we'd have a clear window to sneak Waffles into Bree's car and drive him somewhere, anywhere, before my parents were fully up and moving around the house. It felt like a reasonable plan. It was not a reasonable plan. It assumed that nothing else would go wrong between 1:30 and 6, which, given the trajectory of the evening so far, was a wildly optimistic assumption. I must have drifted off around 2, because the next thing I remember is Waffles' cold nose pressing against my cheek and a low, uncertain growl vibrating in his chest, the kind of sound a dog makes when it hears something it doesn't understand and hasn't decided yet whether to be afraid of it or bark at it. I opened my eyes into pitch darkness, disoriented for a second about where I even was, and then I heard it too. Footsteps. Not the careful tiptoeing footsteps from before, heavier ones, coming down the basement stairs. I shook Bree awake with a hand clamped over her mouth before she could make a sound, and in the 2 or 3 seconds I had, before the basement light flicked on, I did the only thing my brain could come up with, which was grab Waffles, shove him behind the closed curtain that covered the little basement window well, and physically place myself in front of it, cross-legged on the floor, doing my absolute best impression of a girl who had simply chosen, for no reason at all, to be sitting on the floor in the dark at 2 in the morning. The light came on. My dad stood at the bottom of the stairs in his gray sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, flashlight in hand, which he apparently kept on his nightstand for exactly this kind of situation, scanning the room with the focused, slightly wild look of a man who has heard something in his house at 2 a.m. and is not going to rest until he identifies it. "Dad," I said, my voice coming out about an octave higher than usual. "What's wrong?" "I heard something," he said, sweeping the flashlight across the room, over the couch where Bree was sitting bolt upright, pretending very hard to have just woken up naturally, over the TV, over the pile of blankets, and then, with the kind of instinct that only a father who has spent 17 years learning his daughter's tells can possess, directly at me. "Why are you sitting on the floor like that?" "I was, doing stretches," I said. "For my back. I have basketball tryouts coming up." "I do not play basketball. I have never played basketball." My dad knows I have never played basketball, and I watched this fact register on his face in real time, his eyebrows drawing together, the flashlight beam settling somewhere just past my shoulder, right at the edge of the curtain behind me, where, at that exact moment, Waffles decided it would be a good idea to sneeze. It was not a subtle sneeze. It was the kind of full-body sneeze that shakes a small dog's entire frame, and it came with an audible little huff of sound that, in the silence of that basement, might as well have been a fire alarm. My dad's flashlight snapped toward the curtain. "What was that?" "What was what?" I said, which is possibly the single worst thing a person can say when they are actively trying to convince someone that nothing happened, because it only confirms that something did. "That sound," he said, taking a step closer, and I felt Bree go rigid on the couch behind me, both of us watching my dad move toward the curtain, with the slow, deliberate caution of someone who has genuinely started to wonder if there's a raccoon, or a bat, or something worse hiding in his own basement. I could have let him find out right then. Honestly, looking back, it probably would have been easier. Would have saved us both a lot of stress in the next 10 minutes. But panic makes you do things that don't hold up to logic. And in that moment, my body made a decision before my brain fully signed off on it. And I stood up, spread my arms slightly like I was some kind of human shield, and said, "Dad, it's fine, I promise. Just, can you please not look behind the curtain?" There is possibly no sentence in the English language more guaranteed to make a parent immediately look behind a curtain than, "Please don't look behind the curtain." And I understood this the instant it left my mouth, watching my dad's expression shift from confused to deeply, deeply suspicious. "Ashley," he said, in the tone he used maybe twice a year, the tone that meant he was done playing along, "what is behind the curtain?" There was a long pause. Bree, God bless her, chose this exact moment to try to save the situation, blurting out, "It's nothing, Mr. Reeves. Oh, it's just, we were doing a project at 2 in the morning, behind a curtain in my basement." "Yes," Bree said, with the confidence of someone who knew as she said it that it wasn't going to work. My dad reached past me and pulled the curtain aside himself, and there was Waffles, sitting in the little window well where I'd tucked him, looking up at all of us with his head tilted, one ear up and one ear down, tail thumping softly against the carpet like he was hoping this might be the part where someone gave him a treat. Nobody said anything for what felt like a genuinely long time. My dad looked at the dog. He looked at me. He looked at Bray. He looked back at the dog. "Is that a dog?" he said, which, in retrospect, might be the most unnecessary question anyone has ever asked in the history of our house, because it was extremely, undeniably a dog sitting right there. But I think he just needed a second to process what he was seeing, the way your brain sometimes needs a beat to catch up with your eyes. "His name is Waffles," Bree offered, which did not help. What followed was probably the longest 3 minutes of my life up to that point. My dad standing there with his arms crossed, asking questions in this flat, measured voice that was somehow so much worse than if he'd just yelled questions like, "How long has this dog been in my house? And were you planning on telling us at any point?" And my personal favorite, "Does this dog have rabies, Ashley? Do we know anything about this dog's medical history?" Which, fair, we did not. I told him the truth, or most of it, the highlights reel version. Bree finding Waffles on Route 9, the garage situation with her cousin, the one-night plan that had clearly spiraled into something much bigger than either of us intended. I watched my dad's face soften slightly as I talked, not because he wasn't still frustrated, But because I think somewhere in the middle of the explanation, he remembered that Bree had genuinely rescued a scared, freezing animal off the side of a busy road, which is a hard thing to stay mad about even when you're mad about everything surrounding it. You girls have been smuggling this dog around my house for 6 hours, he said finally, including apparently letting him outside in the middle of the night, which, by the way, I want to hear about later because your mother saw something in the yard and thought she was losing her mind. My stomach dropped. She saw him? She saw something. She didn't know what. She's been low-key convinced for the last hour that we have a raccoon problem. He rubbed a hand down his face, and for the first time since he'd flicked that flashlight on, something that might have been the beginning of a laugh flickered at the corner of his mouth, though he was clearly fighting it. This family cannot keep a secret from each other for 6 hours. I don't know why I'm surprised. That was the moment I realized we might possibly survive this. He made us bring waffles upstairs, both because he wanted my mom to see what all the fuss had been about, and I suspect because he did not want to leave two teenage girls unsupervised in a basement with a dog for the rest of the night after everything that had already happened. My mom was sitting up in bed when we walked in, hair everywhere, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the look on her face when she saw Waffles trotting into her bedroom at 2:30 in the morning was somewhere between relief and pure disbelief. "That's the raccoon," she said, flat, staring at the dog. "That's the raccoon," my dad confirmed. "I have been lying here for 40 minutes convincing myself we have a wildlife infestation. I know, I'm sorry. It's a dog. His name is Waffles." My mom looked at me, then at Bree, then back at the dog, who had made himself comfortable at the foot of the bed, like this had been the plan all along, and something in her expression shifted the same way my dad's had, the anger giving way, slowly, grudgingly, to something softer. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Nobody is sleeping through the rest of this explanation. Everyone downstairs. Someone make coffee. Ashley, decaf for you, you're already vibrating." So there we were at nearly 3 in the morning, sitting around our kitchen table like it was some kind of emergency family summit. My dad in his gray sweatpants, my mom wrapped in her robe with her arms crossed, Bree and I still in our pajamas, and Waffles curled up on the kitchen floor by the pantry, apparently unbothered by the fact that he had single-handedly caused the biggest household disruption our family had seen in years. Tyler, who had been woken up by all the commotion, wandered in at some point in a t-shirt 3 sizes too big, took one look at the dog and said, with the deep satisfaction of a 13-year-old who has just been handed free blackmail material, "I knew I heard something. I told you, Ashley. I literally texted you." "Nobody asked you, Tyler," I muttered. "I'm just saying I called it." "Everyone quiet," my mom said, in the voice she used at the hospital when she needed a room to settle down. And it worked on us the same way I imagine it worked on her patients. Immediate and total silence. She looked at Bree first. "Sweetheart, I need you to walk me through this from the very beginning. Not the version where you skip the part where you decided smuggling a stray dog into someone else's house at 11 o'clock at night was a good idea, the whole thing." Bree, to her credit, did not try to minimize it. She told the story straight, the drive back from her cousin's house, the dog darting along the shoulder of Route 9, how she couldn't just leave him there with cars going 60 miles an hour past a scared, disoriented animal, how her cousin's mom had given her exactly 1 week, and that week had run out with nowhere for Waffles to go. She got a little emotional telling it, her voice catching when she described how skinny he'd been, how his paws were cut up from walking on gravel. And I watched my mom's expression change the way it always did when there was an actual creature in need involved. Because if there was one thing about my mother that had never once wavered in 17 years, it was that she could not resist a sad animal story. "So you panicked," my dad said, not unkindly. "And instead of calling an actual shelter or calling us, you decided the solution was a covert overnight operation in our basement." "When you say it like that, it sounds bad," Bree admitted. "It was bad," my mom said, "though there wasn't much heat behind it anymore. You girls letting him outside alone in the middle of the night, in the dark, is what actually worries me. He could have run off. He could have gotten hit by a car right outside our own house. It's not a hypothetical. That's exactly the kind of thing that happens." That part landed harder than anything else that had been said all night because she was right, and I hadn't let myself think about it in the moment, too focused on not getting caught to consider what would have actually happened if Waffles had bolted into the dark instead of trotting obediently back to us. I felt my face go hot with something closer to shame than embarrassment. "I know," I said quietly. "We should have just told you guys. I think I was more scared of you saying no than I was thinking about whether the plan even made sense." My dad studied me for a second, the kind of look that used to make me squirm as a little kid whenever I'd done something wrong. And then he sighed, long and slow, the sigh of a man who was too tired to stay properly angry and had also somewhere in the last half hour gotten quietly attached to the dog currently snoring softly by his pantry. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "Tonight, right now, this dog is not going back outside, and he's not going back to some garage. Tomorrow, first thing, we're taking him to the vet to get him checked out, because for all we know, he's got fleas or worse, and frankly, I don't love the idea of him having spent the last several hours on my furniture without a checkup. Then we call around to shelters and rescues, and if nobody claims him and nothing turns up, we figure out what makes sense from there. That's not a promise we're keeping him. That's a promise we're doing this the right way, instead of the 2 a.m. smuggling way." Bree's whole face lit up like she'd already won, and my mom, sensing exactly where this was headed, pointed a finger at her before she could say anything. "That is not a yes to adoption. That is a yes to doing this properly instead of like a heist movie." "Understood," Bree said, in a tone that made it very clear she did not, in fact, consider the matter closed. We didn't get much sleep after that. By the time everyone had calmed down enough to head back to bed, it was almost 4 in the morning, and Bree and I lay on the pull-out couch staring at the ceiling, Waffles wedged between us, both of us too wired from adrenaline to actually drift off. "That went so much better than it could have," Bree whispered. "Speak for yourself," I said. "I've never sat on a basement floor pretending to stretch for basketball tryouts before in my life. I don't even know where that came from. It was genuinely the worst lie I've ever heard you tell." I panicked. "You told your dad you were doing back stretches while physically blocking a curtain with your whole body. That's not a lie, that's a hostage negotiation." I started laughing, the kind of laughing that happens when you're exhausted and relieved, and the adrenaline is finally draining out of your system all at once. And Bree joined in, both of us trying to be quiet about it and failing completely. Waffles lifting his head between us like he wasn't sure what was so funny, but was willing to go along with it. Around 5, I finally drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, and when I woke up a few hours later, sunlight was coming through the basement window and the whole night felt almost like something I'd dreamed, except for the very real, very solid little dog curled up asleep against my side, snoring softly, one paw twitching, like he was chasing something in a dream of his own. Upstairs, the kitchen smelled like coffee and pancakes, which was either a good sign or a very ominous one. And I climbed the stairs still half in my pajamas to find my mom at the stove, my dad scrolling through something on his phone at the table, and taped to the refrigerator at kid height, a printout Tyler had apparently made sometime that morning. A crudely designed missing dog flyer with Waffles' description on it, which it turned out he'd made not to be helpful but purely so he could say, for the rest of his natural life, that he was the one who found the real solution while the rest of us were too busy sneaking around. "Morning," my dad said without looking up from his phone. "Vet appointment's at 11. I already called." "You're really doing this," I said. "I'm really doing this," he confirmed. "Your mother has already looked up 4 different rescue organizations and has strong opinions about all of them." "I have reasonable opinions," my mom said from the stove. "One of them has a 2-star rating because they apparently lost someone's cat. I'm allowed to have concerns." I sat down at the table, and for a minute it was just quiet, normal, the kind of Saturday morning our house usually had, except for the small brown and white dog now sniffing his way curiously around the kitchen island, and the distinctly charged silence between my parents that told me this conversation was not in fact over. "We're going to talk more about the whole sneaking a dog into the house at midnight thing," my mom said finally, sliding a plate of pancakes in front of me. "Later, when we've all had actual sleep, and I'm not running purely on adrenaline and lukewarm coffee." "Understood," I said. "And you're grounded for 2 weeks. Regular reasons. Sneaking around, lying to your father's face about basketball tryouts you are not trying out for, letting an animal outside alone at night without telling anyone." "That's fair," I said. And I meant it, because honestly, hearing it laid out like that, in the calm light of a Saturday morning with pancakes in front of me, it did sound exactly as unreasonable as it had felt at 2 a.m., just from a different angle. "Bree's staying for breakfast," my dad added, but I already texted her mom the highlights. She thought it was hilarious, for the record. Less funny to us at 2 in the morning, somehow. Bree came upstairs a few minutes later, hair a mess, wearing one of my sweatshirts, and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway at the sight of Waffles happily eating scraps of bacon off the floor that Tyler was very obviously sneaking him, despite 3 separate warnings not to. "Wait," she said slowly. "Are we actually doing the vet thing?" "We are actually doing the vet thing," my mom confirmed. "Don't get attached. This is a temporary arrangement pending shelter contact. Bree looked at me across the kitchen with an expression I recognized immediately. The exact same look she'd given me in the cafeteria a week earlier when she first told me about finding waffles on the side of the road. Pure, unfiltered hope. And I already knew, the way you know these things about people you've been friends with for 7 years, that temporary arrangement pending shelter contact was not going to survive contact with my mother's soft spot for scruffy dogs with one ear up and one ear down. I was right, for what it's worth. The vet appointment that Saturday morning turned into its own small saga, one that Bree and I still laugh about, though at the time, it added a whole new layer of stress to an already exhausting weekend. My dad drove, mostly, I think, because he wanted to see for himself exactly what kind of shape this dog was actually in. And my mom rode along in the passenger seat, firing off questions from a list she'd apparently written on the back of a grocery receipt while the pancakes were still cooking. Things like whether waffles needed to be tested for heartworm and whether a week in someone's garage counted as sufficient quarantine before he could be safely around other animals. Questions that made it very clear she had already, despite every claim to the contrary, started thinking of this as more than a temporary situation. Bree and I sat in the back seat, with waffles between us and a borrowed carrier, and about halfway to the clinic, he started whining. This thin, anxious sound that made my chest hurt a little, and Bree unzipped the top just enough to slip her hand in and scratch behind his ears until he settled. "He's probably never been in a car that wasn't an emergency," she said quietly, and nobody in the front seat said anything back, but I saw my mom glance in the rearview mirror at exactly that moment, and I knew right then that whatever thin argument she'd been holding on to about this being purely temporary had just lost a little more ground. The clinic itself was a small practice tucked between a nail salon and a sandwich shop, the kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and wet dog, and the vet, a stocky older man named Dr. Alvarez, who had apparently been treating our family's pets since before I was born, looked at Waffles for exactly 4 seconds before glancing up at my dad with an expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "So, let me get this straight," he said, snapping on a pair of gloves. "Your daughter's friend found this dog on the side of Route 9, kept him in a garage for a week, and then he spent last night hiding behind a curtain in your basement, while your kids pretended to do basketball stretches. That's roughly the timeline, yes," my dad said, in the flat, tired voice of a man who had already resigned himself to retelling this story for the rest of his life. Dr. Alvarez laughed, a real laugh, the kind that made Bree and me exchange a look of mild betrayal, since up until that point we'd been hoping the adults in the room might eventually stop finding this quite so funny. "Well," he said, running his hands gently along Waffles' ribs, checking his ears, peering into his mouth while Waffles endured it all with remarkable patience for a dog who'd had by any measure an unusually eventful week. "Good news is he's underweight, but not in bad shape overall. No obvious injuries beyond some cuts on his paw pads that are already healing. I'd guess he's somewhere between 1 and 2 years old. Someone trained him at some point. You can tell by how well he's taking this exam. He didn't just wander off from nowhere. Somebody lost him or lost track of him, and given where your friend found him, out on that stretch of Route 9, my guess is he either got loose from a yard nearby or somebody dropped him off, which happens more than people want to believe. That last part landed heavier than I expected it to. I'd been so caught up in the chaos of the night before, the sneaking and the hiding and the flashlight in my face, that I hadn't really let myself think too hard about how Waffles had ended up alone on the side of a busy road in the first place, and hearing the vet say it so plainly that someone might have deliberately left him there made the whole thing feel a lot less like an adventure story and a lot more like something genuinely sad that Bree had stumbled into the middle of. "Is there a way to find out who he belongs to?" my mom asked, "in case somebody's looking for him?" "No microchip," Dr. Alvarez said, running the scanner over Waffles' shoulders a second time just to be sure. "No tags, no collar. I can put a notice up here at the clinic, and you should check with the county shelter and post in a couple of the local lost pet groups online, just to cover your bases, but if nobody claims him within a couple weeks, realistically, he's either going to end up back at a shelter or he's going to need a home. Those are pretty much the two options." My dad and mom exchanged one of those silent married couple looks that somehow communicate an entire conversation without a single word being spoken, and I watched Bri hold her breath beside me, watched her hands twist together in her lap in a way that made it obvious how much this mattered to her, how much this particular dog, out of every stray she could have found on the side of a road, had already worked his way into something she wasn't going to be able to just walk away from. "We'll do the postings," my mom said finally, "and the shelter check. And if nothing turns up, She paused, glancing at my dad, who gave the smallest, most reluctant nod I have ever seen a grown man give. If nothing turns up, we'll talk about next steps. Bree made a small, strangled sound of pure joy that she tried very hard to disguise as a cough, and I elbowed her in the ribs to get her to stop before she gave away exactly how much she was already planning Waffles' future. Dog beds and toys and a whole life he hadn't technically been approved for yet. The drive home was quieter, calmer, all of us a little worn out from a night with almost no sleep and a morning full of unexpected feelings about a scruffy stray dog none of us had known existed 48 hours earlier. Waffles fell asleep against my leg somewhere around the halfway point, his little chest rising and falling steadily, completely unaware of the fact that 4 different humans in that car were quietly, separately, already rearranging their entire mental picture of what our family looked like to make room for him. It took about 11 days. The shelters were full, one rescue never called back, another wanted an adoption fee my parents thought was outrageous for a stray they'd already covered vet bills for. And somewhere in the middle of all that logistics and paperwork, Waffles had quietly become the kind of fixture in our house that you couldn't picture the kitchen without. Curled up under the table during dinner, waiting by the door every afternoon when Tyler got home from school, sleeping eventually in a proper dog bed in the corner of the living room that my dad bought just in case, a phrase he used the exact same way he'd used temporary arrangement, which is to say, not honestly at all. My dad still brings up the basketball tryouts thing at least once a month, usually at the worst possible time, usually in front of someone I'm trying to impress. My mom still calls that first night the Great Raccoon Scare of junior year and tells it at every single family gathering with more dramatic flair each time, to the point where in her most recent version, she was apparently one deep breath away from calling animal control on her own basement. Tyler still insists, to anyone who will listen, that he solved the entire case, despite the fact that his contribution consisted of texting me one confused message and then going back to sleep. And Waffles, for the record, sleeps at the foot of my parents' bed most nights now, which my dad complains about constantly and would clearly fight anyone who suggested changing. Looking back, what strikes me most isn't even the panic of that night, or the ridiculous lengths Bree and I went to trying to hide a dog from 2 very light sleepers in a house with vents that carry sound like a megaphone. It's how close we came to just handling it the easy way, the honest way, and chose the hard way instead, purely because we were scared of a conversation that, when it finally happened, turned out to be nowhere near as bad as we'd built it up to be in our heads. My parents weren't the obstacle. Our own assumptions about them were. If we just knocked on that bedroom door at 7 o'clock instead of building an entire secret operation around a scared little dog, we probably would have ended up in the exact same place, minus the flashlight in my face, and the 2 hours of my life I will never get back from crouching behind a basement curtain doing fake stretches. But I guess if we'd just asked, my mom wouldn't have a story about the Great Raccoon Scare to tell at every holiday dinner for the rest of our lives. And Tyler wouldn't have his one shining moment of being technically right about something. And honestly, Waffles wouldn't have gotten quite as good a story about how he ended up with a family. Some things work out in spite of the terrible decisions that got you there, not because of them. And I think that might be the actual lesson, if there is one. Just don't expect me to admit that to my dad. He'd never let me hear the end of it.